Cold cases are some of the most intriguing cases for the mystery that ends up in a plethora of discourse because of the many what-if scenarios that arise from just the mystery. But the ones that catch the attention of most are the cold cases where the killer was never found. These kinds of killers are very elusive just because they were never caught. Killers like Jack the Ripper and the Zodiac Killer are very infamous in all of history. They have been the target of various criminal investigations. But there is one that I found very interesting, that was never caught in a sense. They are the boogeyman who we were taught to fear as children, the monster who was lurking in the shadow, those who would prey on the weak when they would least expect it. This case is no different as other killers were never caught. His work drove a whole town into a state of panic, this killer being the Axeman of New Orleans. This killer's whole epithet is pretty self-explanatory. He was a serial murderer who would attack his victims with his axe that he left at the scene of the crime. Part of what makes him interesting is how he made a whole town play jazz, and even one singer made a jazz song in his honor. So, where did his bizarre story start? Or who might have been behind the gruesome murders? This story starts late at night on May 23, 1918. Joseph Maggio and his wife Catherine were sleeping late at night after a day of work, and whilst they were sleeping, unknowing of their brutal demise, someone broke into the house in the late hours of the night after they went to bed. We don't know too much about the atrocities that happened that night, but what we do know is about the aftermath, when both Joseph and his wife were both a bloody mess. The couple had their throats with a razor, and both victims' heads were mangled due to them being hacked at by an axe. A pair of bloody clothing was found at the scene, which the assailant presumably ditched for a fresh pair of clothes before he left the crime scene. Surprisingly, Joseph survived the attack, but he died only minutes after being found by both of his siblings. An immediate investigation began, and the police uncovered a razor that was found on the lawn of a neighbor who lived next to the Joseph. The razor seems to belong to Joseph, so it was assumed that the perpetrator used the razor found at the scene, which belonged to Joseph's brother, Andrew Maggio, who was a barber. A worker from the barber shop said that Andrew gave Joseph the razor, stating that Joseph had offered to hone the blade since it had become dull over time. Andrew lived right next door to his brother and only discovered the gruesome scene 2 hours after it had happened. Andrew blamed himself for not hearing the commotion earlier, as he was intoxicated during this time after coming back from a party, and he only noticed after he heard a strange groaning coming from his brother's house. Andrew would later become the prime suspect due to his statement not being clear to the police, and they thought that he was hiding something, as well as his statement about witnessing a man lurking in the shadow. Catherine Maggio was not lucky. She had died a lot earlier than her husband Joseph. The damage to her throat was so severe to the point her head was nearly severed. So this was the beginning of the terror that New Orleans would dub as the Axeman, but they didn't know this because Joseph and Catherine were the first two victims to the monster who was lurking in the shadows. Nothing was stolen, so police concluded that this was a cold-blooded murder case, but the scene left behind was the stuff of nightmares. There was no definite evidence that led them to an arrest, and before anyone says that he would have been caught with forensic evidence, yes, he would have, but this was before that was even common. Fingerprints were a thing at the time, but weren't the norm for criminal investigations, so there was not a lot of conclusive evidence. The killer entered through one of the bottom panels of the door, which is already pretty small to fit into. The cops didn't do too much, well they couldn't do much, until the killer would strike again at the late hours of the morning before anyone would be able to hear anything or anyone. On June 28, 1918, in the late hours of the morning, Louise Besmer and his mistress Harriet Lowe would meet a grim fate when the Axeman struck again in the back of a grocery store located at the corner of Dorgenois and the Harp Streets. Both Besmer was struck in the head numerous times with a hatchet on his right temple, which probably caused a skull fracture after being struck. As for Harriet, she was struck many times on her left ear and was left there to bleed out. The couple were discovered around 7 a.m. by John Zanka, who was a driver of a bakery wagon, and found both of them in a puddle of blood. The weapon found at the scene was an axe that belonged to Besmer, but surprisingly, Besmer would live to tell the tale alongside his mistress, who both lived after being rushed to the hospital. The police were quick to put the blame on Louis Subicon, who was a 41-year-old African-American man. There was not much evidence to point to him being the one responsible, and people think that this arrest was racially motivated because Lowe stated that the man who attacked her and Besmer was a mixed-race man. But the police concluded that she was in a state of disillusion. During this time, things took a strange turn, as letters written in German, Russian, and Yiddish was found. People thought that Besmer was a German spy, and instead of trying to solve the case, and to his dismay, his mistress would later also accuse him of being a spy, so Besmer was arrested. but two of the lead investigators were demoted for their unacceptable work on the case. Harriet was making wild claims that never led to anything. She would blame Besmer for the attack, which is strange since they were both victims of the same suspect. Harriet would make false claims about Besmer's person, and she was just full of shit during this entire investigation. This turned into there being an affair between Besmer and Harriet, so the focus was more on the drama, as opposed to the attack which Besmer's wife would come back to. Harriet died shortly after the attack on August 5th, 1918. It was only a matter of time before he struck again amidst the chaos that was happening in the media. During the early evening hours of August 5th, 1918, the Axeman would strike again, and the unfortunate victim was 28-year-old Anna Schneider, who was 8 months pregnant. Was the next target when her home on Elmira Street had an unexpected visitor. Schneider had been asleep during this time and was awoken when she heard someone entering her apartment. She thought her husband came home early, but she was sorely mistaken. To her dismay, she would encounter a looming shadow towering over her, and during this time, the Axeman would take his chance to pounce and left her a bloody mess with his scalp being cut open and her face bloodied with not much evidence. He would leave until her husband Ed Schneider would find her around midnight when he would return from work. She was rushed to the hospital and both Anna and her baby were saved. When the police would investigate her house, they found no forced entry, and nothing was stolen apart from the few missing dollars that were not found in Ed's wallet. Police came to the conclusion that she was bashed in the head with a lamp as well as an axe that were both found in Anna's house. The axe was missing, nowhere to be seen. Police thought that this could have been the work of an ex-convict, James Gleason, but not much was found that would link back to him, so the police were at a loss as to who could have been responsible. The police would soon try to connect the dots, and they would speculate that the Maggio couple as well as Besmer and his mistress were attacked by the same perpetrator. Either way, this attack threw a wrench into the police's work, as this was different because the attack had a different pattern. There was no axe on the scene, and the victim was a single woman, as opposed to the typical 2 attacks. But they eventually tried to link the previous attack to the Axeman. Fear would arise as people had more questions and the police were not able to find any evidence, much less a potential suspect that was responsible for the grisly attacks. After a few days of sleepless nights for everyone, the killer would strike once again near Taunting and Gravis Street, only 5 days later after the attack on August 10th, 1918. This time the victim was Joseph Romano, who was an elderly man who lived with his nieces Pauline and Mary Bruno, who was alone when the Axeman struck and had struck Romano in the head, leaving him bleeding in 2 areas after having his skull bashed by an axe. His niece would be alerted to the sounds, but the only thing that they would find was the aftermath of said attack. Pauline was asleep during the commotion, but went to investigate the noise, and she noticed a figure who was mostly hidden in the darkness. The man had his eyes fixed on her, and she would let out a scream that would wake up her sister Mary, and both girls were paralyzed in fear. The Axeman was contemplating on what to do, whether to silence the girls or to spare their lives. Fortunately for the girls, the killer decided to leave, and both girls managed to catch a glimpse of the man who had been terrorizing New Orleans. Both girls claimed that they had seen a potential perpetrator when they found a dark-skinned, giant man who wore a dark suit and a slouch hat, leaving the scene in a rush after the attack. The house was ransacked, but nothing was stolen. The only thing that they found was the signature motif of a bloody axe that was located outside in the backyard. Romano was rushed to the hospital, but this time he was only alive for 2 days after the attack. Authorities found out that the Axeman broke in through a back panel found in the back door where he broke into, but he would vanish in the night before he was caught. He managed to slip into a house where multiple people were present, and then he was able to take the life of one victim from right under their noses. He seems to be undetectable, seemingly moving through the houses like a specter pouncing on his prey. When the time came, this brought down the public's morale, as the unfound killer was now seen as something more unearthly. Was this Axeman a demon of sorts that was hell-bent on destruction? Or was this one of the most psychotic yet genius serial killers in American history? Whatever the case was, this was unbelievable to everyone, and the police once again came up empty-handed. During this time, the authorities not only had to deal with the baffling case of serial killer, but they had the impossible task of calming down the public amidst the increasing mass hysteria, and they needed answers. Retired Italian detective John D'Antonio made a hypothesis that the similarities between previous attacks on prior victims were found at each scene. Therefore, there had to be a connection due to these emerging patterns probably coming from the same person. He stated that the figure was someone who had a dual personality, as far as we were concerned. What made this monster scary was the fact that this person was controlled by their twisted vices, but he hid amongst regular people. D'Antonio would later refer to this person as having similarities akin to Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. This monster was hiding in plain sight, and people were making calls that claimed to know the identity of this unknown evil. Things were silent for a long time, and people would not really forget his influence, as people were in a constant state of panic. Men would arm themselves with weapons, as they would do everything to protect their families, and authorities would also have more police on patrol. People would soon ease up as they thought the killer would get caught in an instant if he decided to strike, so things were seemingly dying down, and during this time the Spanish flu was rampant, as well as the beginning of the First World War. So people's attention was directed elsewhere. But the Axeman couldn't stay quiet for too long, so he decided to come back from his hiatus and carried out his next attack 7 months after the last incident on March 10th, 1919. Charles Cortamiglia was attacked alongside his wife Rose and infant daughter Mary were targeted by the Axeman. Charles was fighting the Axeman and he would be struck down. To the horror of his wife, who woke up due to the commotion, they too would meet the same fate, as all members of the family were struck in the head and had skull fractures. Both adults survived the attack, but unfortunately, the infant daughter Mary would not survive a hit to the head. Orlando Giordano heard a loud scream coming from the Cortamiglia residence and went to investigate what had happened, and to his shock he found the family all in critical condition and they were all rushed to the hospital. Eventually both Charles and his wife were able to recover from the attack and they were promptly questioned as to what had happened, and Rose would blame Giordano and his 18-year-old son Frank of murder. This was baffling as they didn't fit the profile for the serial killer. At the scene, the police noticed that there was a broken panel in the back door that had been chiseled by an axe that was found in the back porch. The police concluded that Giordano was not the culprit and he had very poor health. Giordano was a 69-year-old man, and he had arthritis as well as being partially blind in one eye. He couldn't physically carry out an attack as brutal as the one that had happened to the Cortamiglia family. As for his son Frank, he was a big man who was 6 feet tall and 200 pounds. He was capable of taking down the family with his strength, so he had the physical capability, but he couldn't fit in the small front panel that was carved out by the actual murderer. So these two suspects should have been cleared of any suspicion, right? But the police, in a stupid move, would convict him of murder and would sentence Giordano to life in prison, and his son Frank was sentenced to death by hanging. There was a vendetta between the Cortamiglia family and the Giordano rivalry that was mostly instigated by Rose. As for her husband, he didn't care. He was more concerned about the attack. Charles called out her bullshit and said that this was wrong, but Rose continued, and this was the reason why they would later divorce, over this heartless act of perjury. Rose would later confess that she would make these false claims, saying that she had accused both Giordano and Frank out of spite and jealousy. So with this confession, both Giordano and Frank's names were cleared. After another red herring, the police were at a loss as they would blindly follow the word of a woman who was not telling the truth, and they had the evidence to prove Rose was wrong, as they still would go through with the false case. Whilst the media was witnessing yet another circus show, the Axeman would make his presence known to the general public once a letter that was presumed to have come from the Axeman himself would surface. The letter was titled Hell, March 13th, 1919, and it would go like this. Esteemed mortal of New Orleans, they have never caught me and they never will. They have never seen me, for I am invisible, even as the ether that surrounds your earth. I am not a human being, but a spirit and a demon from the hottest hell. I am what you Orleanians and your foolish police call the Axeman. When I see fit, I shall come and claim other victims. I alone know whom they shall be. I shall leave no clue except my bloody axe, besmeared with blood and brains of he whom I have sent below to keep me company. If you wish, you may tell the police to be careful not to rile me. Of course, I am a reasonable spirit. I take no offense at the way they have conducted their investigations in the past. In fact, they have been so utterly stupid as to not only amuse me, but His Satanic Majesty, Francis Joseph. But tell them to beware. Let them not try to discover what I am, for it were better that they were never born than to incur the wrath of the Axeman. I don't think there is any need of such a warning, for I feel sure the police will always dodge me, as they have in the past. They are wise and know how to keep away from all harm. He was mocking the police for their incompetence, as well as warning people that he would strike yet again if they were not careful. The Axeman also alluded to otherworldly beings, such as the Angel of Death and a satanic entity of sorts called Francis Joseph. He would reaffirm they would be far worse due to his close relation to the Angel of Death, and the Axeman had no qualms of killing thousands. But what is the most amusing was his ending statements near the end of the letter, which says, "Now to be exact, at 12:15 earthly time, or next Tuesday night, I am going to pass over New Orleans. In my infinite mercy, I am going to make a little proposition to you people. Here it is. I am very fond of jazz music, and I swear by all the devils in the nether regions that every person shall be spared in whose home a jazz band is in full swing at the time I have just mentioned. If everyone has a jazz band going, well then, so much the better for you people. One thing is certain, and that is that some of you people who do not jazz it out on that specific Tuesday night, if there be any, will get the axe." He would end his letter with a chilling warning saying, "I have been, am, and will be the worst spirit that ever existed, either in fact or realm of fancy." On Tuesday night on March 18th at 12:15 o'clock, as the letter would specify, the whole city of New Orleans would blare jazz music all night long in the hopes the Axeman wouldn't mark them for death. People would play jazz on radios, restaurants, clubs, and bars would have several patrons visiting these places. Joseph John DeVillia was a composer who would try to capitalize on his letter when he would release a song called "Don't Scare Me, Papa," which was made in response to the incident. The Axeman would follow through with his words, and no one was hurt that night. His terror over the city was what solidified his status as a boogeyman in New Orleans. Whether he was a crazy lunatic, or was he far more than just human? Was he the monster hidden in your closet or under your bed? The figure hidden who hides in the shadows, waiting to pounce on an unsuspecting prey? We would not know who or what was responsible for these atrocities. The citizens of New Orleans would just have to wait and hope they weren't the next victim. The town and community were the ones with a more justifiable fear, as they were the primary victims of the Axeman. People would go on to have sleepless nights as they feared one mistake could cost them their lives, and people were prepared to go out fighting. But he didn't strike, at least not for a while. The next attack would happen on the 10th of August, 5 months after the last attack. Steve Boca was the unlucky victim this time, and in a similar fashion to previous victims, he was attacked in the comfort of his own home. During the late hours of the night, he would be awakened to a dark looming shadow standing over him, and he was struck in the head that would knock him out. But Steve would not go down. He would eventually regain consciousness and would make a break for the exit, and would stumble on his way to his neighbor's house, Frank Genosa. After making it to his neighbor's house, Steve would pass out. Due to the head trauma, Frank would not be able to recall what had happened that night. So yet again, the Axeman would slip away without much evidence left. The only evidence found was a broken panel in the back door. Nothing else was there. As he claimed in his note, the Axeman had vanished into the night with no trace or clues that helped the police. It also didn't help that the victim had no recollection of the attack due to the head trauma. The killer would take his time and would wait for the perfect chance to strike, when no one was looking. On September 3rd, 1919, he would sneak into the house through a back window. Sarah Lawman was Axeman's next target, as she was living alone in her apartment. As she was in the privacy of her own home, she was struck in the head. She had suffered severe head trauma and was missing several teeth, and she was found out after neighbors checked in on her after she didn't answer the door. The neighbors were stunned at the sight they saw once they saw Sarah bloodied, so the neighbors made a call to the police, and Sarah was rushed to the hospital. The only evidence they found was a bloody axe that was found in the front lawn that was used by the Axeman that night. There was no forced entry since the killer slipped into the house through an open window. Sarah, like the previous victims, would not be able to recall any details about the attack. After attacking 7 different people and ending the life of 5 victims, people were paranoid from these attacks that happened in the span of a year. To the delight of the Axeman, everyone was fearing what was to come, but the reign of terror was not enough, as the Axeman would strike once more, this time on October 27, 1919, he would attack Mike Pepitone around midnight, and after a scuffle, Mike's wife, Esther, would wake up due to the noise. Mike had fought for his life, but he was unable to survive the attack, as he was struck in the head a total of 18 times, and Esther would see 2 men leave in a hurry, and she opened her window and began to scream for help. Once the police arrived, they noticed that Mike's skull was caved in and was a mess that made him unrecognizable. Mike didn't make it out of the attack alive, so when the police were investigating, they found 2 strange pieces of details on the scene. The wounds on Mike's head were not an axe, but what seemed to be a large bolt with a heavy nut, similar to those that were used to bolt down carnival tents. Strangely enough, there was a carnival in town during the time of the murder, but there was nothing that came from it. They couldn't find a person once again, and this would mark the end of the killer's reign of terror, and he was vicious with his attack, and it was also frequent. People were puzzled as he just up and vanished, never to be seen by the public. This is where theorists think that the Axeman might have died by this time, or something happened that made him unable to act on his vices. Another theory was that the epithet of the Axeman was used by multiple people, and the reason he wasn't caught was because it wasn't a person, but an assortment of random individuals that carried out their own acts of terror. People think that the person responsible might have just had a vendetta against the victims, and then he would later stop after completing his goal. The Italian mob was another potential suspect due to how clean and effective the attacks were, but the idea was shut down due to the fact that the mob wouldn't engage in indiscriminate violence, especially against mostly innocent people. Like, they wouldn't target women or children unless there was a reason to do something, and they also have a streak of silencing anyone that lives to tell the tale. Most of the victims that did survive long after the attack would live fairly normal lives, excluding the potential PTSD that they probably went through. Whatever the case may be, this elusive killer would go down as one of the most infamous killing sprees that terrorized all of New Orleans during the late 1910s, and he just vanished without a hitch. No real punishment or even anything more than the suspects that were accused of doing the crimes on accounts of a lot of circumstantial evidence. No real suspect was found, and the chances are that this case will never be solved, as this case is well over a century old, and the only thing that we have are old newspapers and police records to go off of. He will forever be known as the Axeman of New Orleans, the killer that was never caught. Thank you for watching the video, and if you enjoyed the video, make sure to give it a like, and if you're new, subscribe to the channel. And I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace!